Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I counted something like 3 or 4 active ambassadors and a number of former ambassadors. My name is Mátyás Sárközi. I'm a Hungarian writer living in London. I worked for the BBC for 35 years. I chaired a lot of roundtable discussions, so I know how to deal with unruly participants. If they start shouting and fighting, I immediately leave the room. It's my task to introduce them in alphabetical order, and I meant that they will talk to you in alphabetical order, but it has been changed. Nevertheless, Sir Brian Cartledge is a diplomat and historian. He served various embassies and then became a political advisor of first Labour Prime Minister Callaghan and then Conservative Prime Minister Mrs. Thatcher. And Mrs. Thatcher was very happy with Brian's ideas, and at the end of his term he asked whether he would like to be an ambassador. And Sir Brian said, by all means, and where? In Budapest. So he took up his job in Budapest and became very interested in Hungarian and Austro-Hungarian history. And then at the end of this stint he was in Moscow, from Kadar's Hungary to the Soviet Union. And when that came to an end, at last he had time to work, because Sir Brian became a principal of Linnaeus College in Oxford, and he could write, and he wrote a huge tom, a nice book on the history of Hungary from that of the beginning to modern days, called The Will to Survive, in Hungarian Megmaradni. And it's a fantastic book. I can recommend it to everybody because it's impartial, and the critics found it very good. Now, there is another book which I can also recommend. Sir Brian Cartledge wrote a much thinner book on Trianon, where the publisher asked him to concentrate on personalities. So tonight, again, he will concentrate on personalities, and through 2 very important players of the First World War era, he will sort of enlarge the subject into a history of the Great War. So Norman Davis, sorry, I already gave everybody's a sir nowadays. Professor, that's also a good title. Professor Norman Davis had also connections with Oxford, because he was a student of A.J.P. Taylor, whom we see a lot in this room, because he had a Hungarian wife and he came to the embassy dues. Well, he had a troubled time when he was a student. First, he wanted to continue his studies in the Soviet Union, and he wasn't let in.
Not true.
Mythical. And then he went to Krakow, where he chose his subject for a doctorate, the Polish-Russian War, and at the Academy of Polish Science, they decided that there wasn't such a war. One cannot do a PhD about this. Correct. Nevertheless, eventually he wrote a very good book on that subject, the Polish-Russian War. He became a professor of Polish history at CEAS, School of Slavic and East European Studies, where at the time I was there, but I couldn't see much because I was not a student of Polish history. And now he spends his time shared between Oxford and Krakow. He's got a Polish wife, and he teaches at both places, and he is concentrating on Poland in the war and diplomatic history. But Professor Davis will wait until the others had their 10 minutes stint and sort of come in and tell us all what was left out by the others. Géza Jeszenski got a Polish-sounding name, like many gentrified people from Upper Hungary, and his grandfather, who was a very good Hungarian, actually died in the First World War at Lviv, which was called Lemberg at the time, in a battle. And he had some stories to tell about his student days, because he went to this old school in Buda called the Toldi Gymnasium, where I was a student too, but much earlier on. And he had a history master who was adamant to celebrate the anniversary of the 1848 Hungarian Revolution against the Austrian oppressors, which wasn't an official holiday in those days. Now it is one of our national holidays. And he took his students to a celebration, and they were punished for this. For 2 years after matriculation, they couldn't enter university because they took part of this celebration. But, the Soviet Empire soon collapsed. The history master named József Antal became prime minister, and Géza became foreign minister. So he served for 4 years as a foreign minister, and when the next election his party didn't win, he was still regarded a good diplomat and able man, and he became ambassador to Washington. At the moment,
was in opposition, I spent police.
oh well. Not during the Horn government, needless to say. But now he's ambassador to Oslo, to Norway, and we are very grateful that you took the trouble to hop on a plane and come just for the day to talk to us. Géza is an expert in diplomatic history. That's what he teaches at Hungary at the university. Of course, you came because our weather here is much better than in Norway. So that's that. The First World War, in Sarajevo, there was an open limousine in which Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife was driven to a hospital to visit some wounded people who were taking part in a further assassination attempt, I think. And suddenly from the crowd, a young man, a student, a Serb from Bosnia-Herzegovina, Gavrilo Princip, jumped out with a gun and bang, bang, killed both of them. And that caused enormous furor, but that was just, as they say, the last drop in the cup in Hungarian. And the chief of staff in Austria, Konrad von Hötzendorf, was asking the Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary, Franz Josef, to declare war on Serbia. And that's how the First World War started, but it's not the full story. And if Sir Brian will talk to us for 10 minutes about Tisa and other great personalities of the time, we will soon learn more about this subject. By the way, every speaker will have 10 minutes, and afterwards you are very welcome to grab the cups and the glasses and drink and eat, and while eating and drinking, ask clever questions. Would you like this?
Two ancient constitutions, a két ős alkotmány. And there were just two passages. Szövetkezett magyar s angol álnok német ellen, így fog jutni győzelemre igaz szabad szellem. so that the Hungarian and the English concluded an alliance against the false Germans, and that is how the true free spirit will be victorious. Continuation is, a legrégibb szent szabadság, tied, hangos magyar, s ha ti ketten összefogtok, győztök együtt hamar. So, if the two of you combine, you'll have a quick victory, because the English and the Hungarian can boast of the oldest holding liberty. Well, it was a rather stupid little piece, but it reflected well, the Hungarians' feeling towards the British. And I cannot say, having studied this and having written a book on the changing image of Hungary in Britain before the First World War, which unfortunately is only half translated into English, and when I go back from Oslo, I hope I will be able to conclude it. But so the English certainly in the late 19th century, second half of the 19th century, reciprocated this feeling, and it was only R.W. Seton Watson and Wickham Steele of the Times who in the first decade of the 20th century challenged this view of the liberty-loving Hungarians. But many Hungarians, especially after the first enthusiasm passed, came to think that, well, it is not proper that these two friendly, old friends are at war. And in fact, this was shared to some degree by the royal court here in Britain. Not because of their love for the Hungarians, although they didn't dislike them, but because the royal family had a very distinct, of course, family relations to the Hungarians, but what was more important, that the Austro-Hungarian ambassador, Count Mansdorf, was also a kind of relation to the British monarchy. And, well, both sides, they were extremely sorry when Britain declared war on Austria-Hungary. It was considered to be only a tactical necessity because of the alliances, but we have nothing against each other. And so it was when actually the Queen even gave a kiss to Mansdorf because they were the relatives, and she said that, well, we expect you soon to be back. Well, he never came back, as far as I know, although in 1917 he was engaged in secret discussions with General Smuts of the War Cabinet on a separate peace with the victorious by then very strong allies. But a separate peace was always on the agenda. And whereas wartime diplomacy on both sides concentrated on how to find new allies because of the standstill on both fronts, and of course it was only Austria-Hungary, or basically on the territory of Hungary, which could be promised to Romanians, to Serbs, obviously, and of course some Austrian to the Italians. But whereas Hungary, and led by Tisza, knew that, well, all efforts must be done to win this war, because if the war is lost, that would be the end of Hungary. But on the other hand, Tisza's opponents, the so-called Independence Party, by that time led by Károly, thought that, at least after a few months, that Hungary should conclude a separate peace, so Hungary should quit the war. It was technically impossible because of their armies, politically also because England was not disliked by the Hungarians, but Tisza too, and everybody thought that it is the German alliance which keeps or helps Hungary to stand up to the minorities. And actually, Tisza preferred the English language to German, although he was, of course, a great speaker in German as well. But in his letters, and which I read some, he said that, well, the political tradition of the British is much more important, and his sympathies lay with them. So finally, what I can say is that there were some efforts by Károly and by his spokesman and emissaries to convince the British to make a separate peace with Hungary, but the British knew on the one hand that they have not really a following, so it is not a realistic option, and also already in late 1914 the British acceded to the Russian plan to give Transylvania to Romania, So with all these later kind of efforts, peace feelers, the British answer was that basically we have promised more than half Hungary to the various countries, so we cannot even entertain the idea of a separate piece.
In your program brochure, there is a sentence that I will lighten up this discussion by anecdote. But I thought that the First World War was such a tragic historical occurrence that it doesn't really make me want to tell any anecdotes. I just tell you that after the first 2 years of the war, Franz Josef died as an old man, and they very quickly wanted to have a coronation both in Vienna and in Budapest. Charles was crowned as emperor and came to Budapest to be crowned as King of Hungary. It was all done in the Mátyás temple, in the coronation church up in the castle district. According to the ancient tradition, they built a little hill in front of the church, and what the Hungarian king is supposed to do at his coronation, on a white horse or a stallion, he drove up to the top of the hill with the crown on his head, which was wobbling because it was too big for him, and that some people took as a very bad omen. And then with the sword, he had to swing the sword at the four corners of the world, and then he went to the church, and he appointed some people to become knights. That's again a tradition at coronation time. And the whole thing was designed by the chief designer of the Hungarian Opera House, who happened to be an aristocrat and a very good writer, Count Miklós Bánffy. You find his novels in the bookshops.
The future foreign minister. And
the future foreign minister, your colleague, yes. And but he was a very good designer, and he had this idea which shocked everybody, but it has shown what a dirty war that was. When the knights came to be knighted in the Hungarian Peace Magyar, Bánffy formed the first row of war wounded, limbless, blind, poisoned by mustard gas, in the dirty, crumpled uniforms, just to show that this war is not only a sort of heroic national thing, but also people are dying by the thousand, and how horrible it is. Well, Professor Davis is not only a apologist, but sort of diplomatic historian, and you could sort of have a parallel of how the Poles tried to get out of this mess, if you could.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Very pleased to be back among friends in the Hungarian embassy, not for the first time. I have already been involved in several panels about the First World War. They're ubiquitous, 2014. And I realize how very difficult it is to present a panoramic, inclusive view of those events. Yesterday, I think on BBC, there was an hour-long program talking about the First World War. Some you may have seen it, called The Big Questions. And the speakers included some very prominent historians. Professor Sir Hugh Strachan from All Souls College, leading historian on the First World War, Professor David Stevenson from LSE, Jeremy Paxman, who has written about almost everything. And they were talking for an hour. And in the hour, they didn't mention Austria-Hungary once. And it seems to be the rule that every country talked about the First World War through its own prism, through its own spectacles. It may be true in Hungary, it probably is. And it's very difficult to break out of the narrow national narratives which prevail. We've had one anecdote about the war beginning of the war in 1914. I thought I'd present another little scene from Central Europe, actually from Austria-Hungary, from the city of Krakow, from which we've just returned. We've been attending the 650th anniversary of the Jagiellonian University. In July 1914, the students of the Jagiellonian University were breaking up at the end of their academic year. And if you know the map of Central Europe at that time, one part of Poland was in Austria, another part was in Russia, and a third part was in Germany. And the students of the Jagiellonian University came from all these three countries. And in the middle of July, they met together outside the Collegium Novum, shook hands, and went home. And graduates in those days were automatically reserve officers in most countries. These boys, within 2 weeks of leaving their university, were fighting as reserve officers in the armies of Austria-Hungary, Germany, or Russia. And that, I think, is something of the Central European painful experience. One thing that the members of yesterday's panel mentioned several times, almost, I think, excessively, was the phrase German expansionism. This is a phrase which summarizes the predominant British and French and American view of the First World War, namely that the principal cause of the war was the expansive ambitions of Germany in particular. I don't think anybody claims that Austria-Hungary was particularly expansive. And this, of course, this view is something which was the foundation of Allied propaganda right from 1914, and was then applied at the end of the war, at the peace conference in Paris in 1919, as the justification for punishing the Central Powers for the war that they were supposed to have caused. There was in the Treaty of Versailles a war guilt clause which specifically blamed the German Empire in particular for having caused the war. And I have to say that of the many books that have been published in London this year in anticipation of this centenary, most of them follow the same line. think there's one which doesn't, the Clark's Sleepwalkers, which is, I think, the best account of the outbreak of war. And Professor Clark, I think, takes a more balanced view of everything. But balance is not the norm among British historians, or indeed among the British public. Most people feel pretty confident that the war was caused by anybody but us. Which brings me on to the next point, Russian expansionism. If ever there was a country which was a specialist in expansionism, or as Lech Wałęsa once said, political tourism, it's Russia. And Russia's expansionist plans in 1914 far exceeded anything that Germany was considering. In fact, as soon as the war broke out, the Russians published a map of the future of Europe, showing how they intended to expand and to change the map of Europe. They would, had they won the First World War, have introduced the same frontiers that Stalin introduced in 1945. It's very revealing. They would have put a Russian prince on the throne of Bohemia. They would have certainly expanded their interest in the Balkans with the use of Serbia. But because Russia was an allied power, a friendly power as far as the British were concerned, none of these ambitions are thought worthy of mention. But I think it's something which Hungarians, like my Polish friends, understand very well indeed. Was there an alternative to what happened in 1914? This has always come up. Of course there was an alternative. There's always an alternative. In any crisis, decisions are taken or are not taken which could have gone the other way. Large decisions, small decisions. And as Brian said, in 1914 somebody had to light the match. If different decisions that could have been made had been made, then the result would have been very different. Some of you may have seen a spoof piece that appeared in Prospect magazine last year, purporting to be an unpublished manuscript of A.J.P. Taylor. It was so good I didn't realize it was a spoof until somebody pointed out. It was written by, I think, Lord Alton. But what it did was present a plausible scenario for an alternative outcome in 1914. And what the alternative scenario was, the British Prime Minister, Mr. Asquith, sends a clear ultimatum to Germany in mid-July, a fictitious ultimatum, saying that if Germany crosses the frontier of Belgium or the Netherlands or France, then the British Empire will be at war. Of course, no such ultimatum was sent. The British contrived to give the impression in Berlin that Britain would not go to war, whilst convincing the French that they would go to war. That was part of the confusion. But the end of this alternative scenario is a founding conference of a united Europe in 1939, presided over by the 81-year-old Kaiser and the 71-year-old Tsar Nicholas II. And the assumption is, which I think is a bit dubious, but nonetheless plausible, that if there had not been a First World War, then the empires of 1914 would have survived. And this means, of course, that pre-Trianon Hungary would probably have survived at least until 1939. It was mentioned that I should introduce a Polish note to this. Poland was in the thick of the fighting on the Eastern Front. Alas, Poland has been in the thick of the fighting on many fronts in European history. But I thought I would mention, because at present we're looking at what people knew, what people thought before the outbreak of war in 1914. Why did they go to war? What were they imagining would happen? A lot of them thought that the war would be over by Christmas. This is certainly what the Germans were thinking of, a rapid 6-week campaign in the west and 2 or 3 months to stop the Russian steamroller in the east. They all got it wrong, except for one man, Joseph Pilsudski. There were 2 prominent men in Europe who thought that a world war was necessary. One was Lenin. Lenin understood perfectly well that his marginal revolutionary socialist movement had no chance whatsoever if there wasn't a world conflagration. And the other was Pilsudski, the leader of the Polish independence movement. He knew that Poland could not possibly be restored if the 3 empires remained intact. The one thing that Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary had in common is that they didn't wish to see the restoration of Poland. So, in 1913, in a lecture in Paris, at the Geographical Society in Paris, Pilsudski presented his hypothesis of how Poland could become independent. The first thing, that a war between the great powers was necessary. Secondly, that on the Eastern Front, the largest of the combatants, Russia, would have to be defeated by Germany. And then thirdly, that the Germans would have to be defeated by the Western powers on the Western Front. And he got it absolutely right. I think the only person before 1914 who worked out not only what was possible, but what he predicted would happen. I think there's very few historians who can get things as right as he did. Thank you very much.